take it on, Magnus.
All right, thank you. So the topic of today is Eiffel and OpenTelemetry traces, and I have a number of slides I'm going to present and gives a little bit of background on OpenTelemetry. I think everyone who is here is well familiar with Eiffel, so I won't do any Eiffel introduction. Make things easier. And I'm in no way an OpenTelemetry expert. I've worked with it for a little while at least, so hopefully I can give some kind of context. I'm sure some of you have worked with OpenTelemetry as well, so feel free to correct me or fill in additional details if needed. Otherwise, let's keep it as a discussion, and we'll see where this takes us. So first of all, what is OpenTelemetry? Well, it's an emerging industry standard that's getting a lot of buzz right now. It's used for exporting metrics, logs, and distributed traces from applications. It's quite welcome, I would say. Previously, sure, we've had Prometheus for a number of years, which is fairly standardized and supported by many tools. Prior to that, there wasn't any real single standard for metrics. Logs hasn't been very standardized at all, actually. Seems a lot of people still rely on just files on disk. Distributed traces have been around for quite some time as well, but there have been a number of competing standards. Various vendors for collecting the data have had their own special SDKs and protocols and all that. In somewhat recent years, there have been two efforts, Open Tracing and Open Census, that have aimed to solve this problem. And for some reason, I don't know the background, OpenTelemetry was founded to basically merge Open Census and Open Tracing, and also add logs and metrics. I think metrics was part of Open Census as well. I'm not too well read on those parts. Anyway, within OpenTelemetry, traces is the most mature specification and implementation. Logs is sort of beta level right now. I think metrics is production grade, but not as mature as traces. And what we're going to be talking about today is really the traces part of OpenTelemetry and how it relates to Eiffel events. I'm somewhat struggling to figure out how metrics and logs could fit into this, so it's traces we're going to focus on. And if you haven't worked with traces and spans at all, I thought I'd give this little primer on what it's all about. So what you see on the right is a visualization of a single trace, which is a collection of one or more spans. And a span describes something that happens in a software system. It tells us when it happens and the duration of this activity. Spans can have relationships to other spans, like in this case. So you would have the root span of this trace is the HTTP post to some /books endpoint. And we can see that it makes two database queries, one select and one insert. And the select comes first, and then comes the insert. And then the whole request is over. And this can be used for analyzing performance, typically. What happens during a particular call, how long does it take, and various other aspects of it. And the main thing about this, as opposed to sort of traditional profiling that's been around for decades, is that it supports tracing requests across boundaries, network boundaries, process boundaries, whatever it is. So you can see get the whole picture, which is of course increasingly important these days with microservices and APIs for everything. Apart from what I talked about for spans, you have a name and a duration and so on, but you can also have other span attributes that give additional context. So for example, the database operation spans in this example would probably contain the exact SQL query that's being made. Probably also, how many rows were affected, and similar thing, what kind of database is it, and so on. Let me know if they have any questions. See, no hands are raised, so okay, we'll continue. So why are we talking about this? Well, traces and Eiffel events, they are definitely related. They both describe things that happen when they happen, and um, they describe relationships to other things that happen. So somehow they are related, but how related are they really, and do we need both? That's sort of one of the key questions for today's discussion. Now, there are definitely differences. So spans are usually pretty close to the code. They could map to exact functions or methods, especially if you're using automatic instrumentation of your code. But you could also use it for more high-level concepts, unrelated to the exact architecture of the code. On the other hand, Eiffel events, they are not as low level. Theoretically, they could be. You could have any granularity on your Eiffel activities, for example, but I've never seen that used anywhere, and it probably doesn't make too much sense either. Um, so Eiffel events usually have more high level, and another difference that I realized is that they focus more on relationships to other Eiffel events. They, of course, you have the data fields, and the data fields convey information, but a lot of the information carried in a set of Eiffel events is how they relate to each other. Um, Spans within a trace also have relationships, but they're more simple relationships. It's a parental relationship. You could have links between spans that would indicate some kind of causality, but otherwise it's much weaker link concept, even though it's actually there. And of course, spans are more limited in the sense that they map fairly closely to Eiffel activities, but there are no um, that's the only thing there is with spans. You can't express artifacts or anything like that, even though you could embed events into spans, but that's another matter. But we need them both. Could we use one or the other? Well, spans, since they are so plentiful, since you can have them with such small granularity, you will produce many spans, and most of them aren't that interesting. So usually you would introduce sampling of your spans. So you can get statistical significance for durations of certain calls, for example, or the error rate of API endpoints, for example. But you don't need to store the actual span data. I saw on the Slack, for one of the Slack channels for OpenTelemetry the other day, was someone who said that he had um, his applications were sending 1 million spans per second. He was asking about, um, he was saying that basically that they will, of course, we do a very heavy sampling to be able to cope with this, but he still had some questions about the scalability of the span collector, the OpenTelemetry collector service. On the other hand, Eiffel events, I've never heard about anyone sampling Eiffel events, even though you theoretically could, and we usually store them for quite some time. At least we never delete them, so we have quite a number of probably billions of events stored, which is something we should probably do something about. But that's how it works right now. Spans, they only announce what has happened. It's only like a record. This and that happened. That all it does. They're not meant to trigger any other action. Well, that's a key property of Eiffel events. Um, Even though Eiffel events, of course, also express what has happened. And even if you would want to trigger something based on a particular span, there is, so the communication model isn't geared for that. There's no broadcast method for spans. The application would send their spans to some kind of collector, which in turn sends it to whatever visualizer or database you have for the spans. They would typically not be announced on a message bus where anyone can consume them. Theoretically, it would be possible to do, of course. In the end, it's just small pieces of data that could be sent on a message bus, but that's not how things usually are set up. Another perhaps minor thing is that spans, they're sent when they end, because they it includes the duration, so you can't send it until then. And so it becomes difficult to monitor things that are ongoing. While in the case with Eiffel activities, we send 2 events close to the start of the activity and then 1 event at the end. Same thing with test cases. And that's something we've been discussing, by the way, regarding deployments, for example. Should we express the start and finish of a deployment, for example, or should we just have afterwards and say that this happened? I know that's a discussion we had some 18 months ago or so. So my conclusion would be that traces and Eiffel events, they might be needed, both of them. They serve different purposes and have different properties. They do overlap in technology and in intent, but it's legitimate that they both exist because of the different needs they serve. So I guess if you might want to use both of them, how could we, since they deal with the related concepts, how could we still connect them in some way? And how would that be interesting? You could have a case where your build emits traces. This could be very relevant if you are interested in performance profiling of your actual build. However, it could be the case that your CI pipeline does not emit traces. It might be easier for you to start with a low level support, but if you don't have support in your CI tool for emitting spans, connecting them could be more difficult. However, you might have Eiffel support in your CI pipeline, and you want to connect your Eiffel events to the lower level spans that that are sent in your build. Or it could be the other way around, that your CI pipeline emits traces, and you want to continue to send Eiffel events for artifacts, and afterwards you want to go in and look at an artifact and locate the trace where it was produced. That's another option. Or it could be some combination of these two in some way.
Magnus, can I interrupt a bit?
Sure.
I have a question there. I want just to sort out the difference between a trace and a span, because I feel a bit that you use them interchangeably. I'm not to sign up on OpenTelemetry, sorry, but my thought was that a span ID is something that you define or you set in the beginning of a chain of something, and then you use that same chain ID through all your traces that belongs, or your trace events, I guess I should say, maybe your trace objects that you send to OpenTelemetry to the service, and then so you use that same span ID all over, which means that all of those trace events belong to the same span. That's how I understood it, and that then each of those traces that you send out, if I use that vocabulary, might be wrong, would then signal that this span is ongoing and things are happening within this span. Is that totally wrong then?
Maybe not totally, but what connects spans is the parent ID. And if you have a span with a null parent ID, it becomes a root span, and it sort of defines it. That's what starts a new trace, basically. And then all the spans that are created from that root will then they will point to their parent. And I think they will also contain the ID of the trace. So if you look at a single span, you can always see what is the parent and what is the overall ID of the trace. And if I remember correctly, I think the ID of the root span is also the ID of the trace, if I remember correctly.
But then if you focus on the parent, then you could see that you get multiple data connected to that parent or over time. So you can see some kind of progress on under that parent. Or
well, you won't see spans they're not sent to whatever is collecting spans until they are completed. So you won't really see well, you can see progress in the sense that if you have child spans that complete, like in the database example, you could theoretically see that, oh, here's this database span, but you won't see it, the parent, so it will sort of be orphaned. So you probably won't see it in any visualizing tool. So that's a bit of a limitation. But there is, yeah. So there are ways of sort of decoupling spans in different ways. For example, if you have asynchronous operations where you have one service that sends a message that's then picked up by some other service, then it would be a bad thing if they would be too connected, so you'd only see them together. So there is a way of declaring that this span is a producer of something, and in the other end you say that the span that links to the producer is a consumer span, and then they will be sort of more disconnected, and a tool that visualizes them understand that it's okay that the consumer starts after the producer has ended. Otherwise, you would have to that will be end up in a weird situation if you think that they are synchronous, all of those spans.
Okay. Yes, a question, Mattias.
Yeah, so basically, as you said, then that if you represent the span with a pipeline as a span, you wouldn't see the end of the pipeline until the pipeline has completed, basically.
I believe that's the case, yes. But that it could be a misconception on my part. But I have seen when I've worked with this that if you don't end spans, or if you don't set the span kind correctly with the producer consumer thing, they won't visualize very well. Things will get disconnected, or spans will be missing, which causes general confusion. So sort of the ongoing observing ongoing behavior is probably a challenge, I would say, in a different way than it is with Eiffel, at least when it comes to activities and test case executions, where we have the three events for showing them.
So go on if you have more to show.
Yeah, I have a few more slides. I'm running the presentation full screen, which is why it's very wide for you, and therefore I don't see when you raise your hand. So just interrupt if there are any questions or other comments. I think I'm done
Actually,
with that
can
slide.
I just jump in then?
Yes, please.
I think that there are span events that you can use to send something at a particular point in time. So for instance, something happened now, you can do with span events in OpenTelemetry, whereas the trace spans, they need to be exited in order for them to be sent.
But aren't the span events part of the span, or are they sent sort of asynchronously?
I don't know exactly. I do know that it says something that it's a meaningful singular point in time event, something, and we use these events within our spans every now and then to add some extra information to our traces. And I think that they arrive when you send it.
Okay,
So you don't have to
interesting.
close it. I think, but it's good to look into it.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of having lots of opinions today, so some of them are right. Hopefully. Okay, so a little bit more on how spans are connected to each other. I mentioned earlier that in response to the question that spans are connected to their parents via the parent ID attribute, or yeah, I don't know the exact attribute name. I think usually it's called parent ID. Now, if you have within a single application that's using an OpenTelemetry SDK and you're creating your spans through that one, this works out pretty automatically. But when you are you want to connect spans across some kind of boundary, it could be a process boundary, a network boundary, whatever, and specifically using some kind of protocol that isn't OpenTelemetry, so to speak. I mean, if you make an HTTP call, how do you transfer the trace context across that HTTP boundary? And that's called context propagation. So you are basically sending along data in some kind of format that's supposed to be universally understandable, so that the HTTP server would be able to send its own spans connected to the original trace. So there's a standard for this from W3C called trace context, and it defines two HTTP headers: the trace parent and trace state. I think trace state is optional, while trace parent has let's say it's 4 groups of hex digits. Doesn't matter that much what exactly they mean, but I think the second one, the long one, is the trace ID, and the third one is the span ID. And this is how it works in HTTP. And so if the HTTP server wants to send a span for handling the request, it will parse this string and use it when it sends its own spans. It could also choose to retain this state as is and pass it on downstream to any other HTTP service, for example, if it's some kind of proxy, for example. So it's totally fine to just be forwarding these headers. So what I'm thinking in the first of my 2 proposals here, why don't we include support in Eiffel events for the trace context in the meta field? They don't have to be named exactly like this, of course. I just copied it as is to make it similar to how it works for HTTP. So in this example, we would express that particular artifact is created within the context of this span. And anyone consuming, I mean, that could be interesting in itself, but it also means that anyone consuming this event could use this trace context for sending their own spans and expressing that they are part of the same trace in some form. Again, it's important to set up the correct span kinds so that things are not entirely connected, but somewhat disconnected. I think this would work fairly well. This field would, of course, be optional. Any thoughts?
It's also new to me to say that it's wrong, but it doesn't seem wrong, at least first glance. So yeah.
So basically, when it comes to the trace parent, is it so that you basically you need to have this generated before you can send the event.
Sure. I mean, if you want to have a trace context in your event, you would have to generate the trace context first. Sure.
Okay, but that is something you can do on the side. You don't have to start a span in order to send the trace context, or can you create the trace context and then start a span?
Typically not. I mean, when you in the SDKs, you would when you create a span, it will create it with the ID. So I don't think you have the option of specifying the ID.
Okay, so you need to start the span and then send the Eiffel event.
Yes, in that case, yes. Which I don't think is going to be a problem. I mean, you would typically, you could have a span that, I mean, either you have sort of a natural, you already have a span defined for creating the artifact, and then you would just pass in that context when you create the Eiffel event that announces the creation of the artifact. Even if you don't have that span already, you could have a span that sort of represents the creation of the event or the sending of the event. That's also a possibility. So there's no, yeah, I don't think that's going to be a problem.
I was thinking, for example, if you want to connect a trace to activity, because then you probably would send an activity triggered first and then activity started. But then you basically, that triggered wouldn't contain a span probably, but it would be maybe the starter that would contain a span, but then you need to start a span before you send the event, Eiffel event there.
Yeah, probably. Yes.
Or
I mean,
would
it
the
depends on,
span,
yeah.
or would the trace be created when you have the when you get the source change event, more or less? That's when the span will be created, or when the trace context will be created, and then you will use that same context within the whole pipeline for all activities following it. Or
Yeah, I'm thinking of the activity when if you were connected to an activity event, you need to start the span first before you.
yeah, but the span could have been started before you even queue it. It can have been started as part of the source change event that comes before you even start the pipeline activity. Or
Oh, sure.
if you have
That could.
if you have something listening to source change stream events from Gary or something, then you can send the source change event there, and you can then create the span before you start the actual activity, the pipeline activity, just based on that.
I guess the if you have an activity, you're probably, if you're listening to source change, then when you receive it, you will probably start an activity, and
Okay, so okay.
yeah, well, we can go on, but that is a tongue twister,
Yes.
probably.
Just so we're clear, just because you start the span does not mean that the span gets sent. It gets sent when the span is closed. So starting a span just before an activity triggered just to get the trace parent is not a problem. So it gets sent when either the sending of the activity triggered has been finished, or when the full activity is finished. That's when the span gets sent.
Yep.
Well,
And
my comment on this, what is the benefit of having it in the Eiffel specification? Because the way we send the trace parent is that we use headers in RabbitMQ for each of our events. So what is the benefit of having something stored persistently forever in an Eiffel event?
that's an interesting question. Sure.
Yeah, especially if the traces here are considered to be more short-lived than the Eiffel events, then this idea doesn't make any sense when the trace has been removed from the database there.
Mm.
No, that's totally true.
Maybe the other way around.
Included. I mean, sure, you could say that the trace would be just part of the envelope if you're using AMQP, which everyone using Eiffel so far is using. You can have it as AMQP headers, which is I don't think it's quite standardized yet, but it will be. It's sufficiently standardized, I think. And if you, for some reason, pass events by some other channel than AMQP, you could probably propagate the context by, if it's HTTP, there's already a standard for that, for example. Well, that's a good question. It's totally conceivable.
I could see a reason. I mean, if you want to store it, of course, I am aware that spans might be more short-lived, but if you just store the Eiffel event and want to find span, then you would need to have some kind of way to extract the metadata from the AMQP and connect it to the Eiffel events in some way. If you don't have the link in the other direction, that is the span that's linking to the Eiffel event.
Yeah, that's my next slide, by the way. But it shouldn't be, let's see. If you have it as headers, it means that if you're not consuming things directly from the bus, you are out of luck. If you're for some reason receiving an ID by some means and you look up the event, you lose the ability to connect to that trace. That might not be a problem, but it would be a consequence of putting it in the message envelope.
In that case, do you really want to connect to the Eiffel events trace parent? Shouldn't there be a different trace for that application where when you start it up, you set up the spans and the trace, and then you collect the messages, and then you have to send events or send spans for that instead? Or do you want to run a software that just gets an ID and then picks up and then connects to a different span somewhere else?
Yeah, that might not be a legitimate use case.
Maybe.
It could very well be, as you say, that if you receive the ID by some other means, if it's through an API call or you get it from some other message bus or whatever it is, yeah, you would probably have your trace context from there instead. Maybe that could be a reason where you want to set up a span link rather than parent-child relationship and be part of the same trace. That could be another use case.
Is there any thoughts here on, for example, if you have activity events, we have 3 of, would a trace parent be part of all of them, or would it be in just a triggered event?
I don't know really. I guess it wouldn't hurt to have the context in all of them, but I don't know if it's strictly necessary either.
If it's the same for all of them, it feels a bit strange to send them in all of the events.
Yeah, I mean, technically it should be enough to have it in the trigger event or whatever is the earliest point where you have it. I think as we talked about a few minutes ago, maybe you don't have the trace context until the activity started, perhaps, or you have there is no way to sort of hook into. Yeah, it depends on where the trace context comes from the start.
I was thinking that for use case of this, where you would like to know afterwards or get the trace information afterwards just by having the ID. For example, if you have a service looking for or listening on, say, conference level events, and it retrieves an event, a conference level event with even an inconsistent result or some failure in it, and you want to troubleshoot it, and you would like to do a query towards your event repository, probably to get all events that led up to that conference level. And then you would like to see, was there some environment issue in the test engine, for example, when this test was executed some minutes ago or some hours ago. And I assume that you will be able to troubleshoot such environmental issues maybe through traces in the test engine that you would then relate to those test events that were sent in the test activity. But you don't realize it until long after, and then you would like to have those relations stored in the test events, the events themselves in the event database. Do you follow my thought there?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I think that's a very good point, because if only have the trace context in the envelope, it means that you need to, whatever triggers what you're doing, you can only trigger it on the events that carry the trace context. An excellent example is the CLM, which totally could be a trigger, or for that matter, an artifact published, because you can't do anything until you can actually download the artifact, for example, and then you need to follow the link to the artifact creation. And unless you have consumed that artifact creation yourself, and therefore had the ability to save the AMQP envelope, you can't retrieve it from the repository unless it's in the payload. So that's actually a realistic example of why it would be useful to have it in the event. Because otherwise it might be I mean, otherwise it might be a feature that theoretically is useful, but because of how programs are written and how they are, triggering things, they won't actually be able to obtain the trace context.
But then we can't actually really specify where to find the trace context. In most of the specification, we say, okay, in this event, you can find this piece of information. But this trace context would be, you need to search the whole chain in order to find it, because it could be, different applications might have it in different places, basically.
Yep.
I guess another option would be to have a trace context defined event, which you would then have a link to from some events. And then you could instead do a downstream search from that trace context defined event to see what events are linked to this.
That's another option. Yep.
I think it would make sense to try to draw these different use cases and see the ones that might make sense, how they would be represented in a combination of the telemetry and Eiffel. In some graphical way or something, unless you've already done that.
No, I'm afraid not. No, this is, I think, my penultimate slide. No, but that's interesting. Please.
Another one there, the trace parent, it has the ID of the trace and the span that is directly the parent of. Is that true?
That sounds correct, yes.
So in the case of these Eiffel events, the trace parent would be different for each event because it would be a different span that is the parent.
Does that have to be the case?
It doesn't have to be, but if I am to connect to a trace from an Eiffel event and I'm further down the line, then I would connect to the first span in that trace. I would not be able to say that, well, I am triggering right after this activity. I have to always specify the first in the parent.
Wait, why would that be the case? Because the trace parent includes the span ID.
Yeah, exactly. And so that we need to have a new trace parent on each event sent, because it has to be a new span for each event so that I can connect at the right place when I am connecting to the trace.
But I mean,
They really
it's the
like
span
what?
ID, not of the root span, but it is the span ID of whatever span it is.
So let's say, I'm going to try to explain this better. Let's say that we always start everything. The whole pipeline is started from a source change event. And very far down, I am starting a test case. There are lots of activities before this. Each activity here, if that it doesn't have a unique trace parent, i.e. a trace parent that connects to the root, as well as this current span, then I down here will, if they don't have that unique trace parent, then I will always connect to the root span when I start my traces.
Right. That's true. But I mean, it's not. Well, that's okay. I mean, if you don't start new spans with sort of increasing resolution, you are relying on the parent span, whatever it is. So I think that's it's not ideal, but it's yeah.
Yeah, because it becomes a bit of an odd thing where I have an Eiffel event, a test case triggered event that connects via Eiffel to an activity, but then it connects via the traces to the root span, which is a source change.
No, I
We're
mean
going to be sending conflicting messages.
I mean, not really. We're using different conveyors of information. So I mean, the test case triggered is span or trace wise, it is connected to the source change event. That's that's what we know in the trace domain. But in the Eiffel domain, we know that it comes from the test suite started or something.
Because this is going to be I mean, it's when we're going to debug this, and in the cases that you talked about when debugging stuff, where you want to connect Eiffel and traces in order to get more information, we would get very confused if those are differently connected. Especially when you're visualizing the trace and my event is connected to the start of the root of the trace, and the Eiffel event is connected to somewhere else in the pipeline. I'm just afraid that adding the trace context into the Eiffel events will start just to increase confusion, because we want to mix Eiffel for traceability and the traces for OpenTelemetry.
Because you're describing a scenario when you were kind of like overlapping, we're sending for the same pipeline. We have both OpenTelemetry traces and also Eiffel events. So they basically overlap both of them, right?
I mean, if we want to get the traces to look the same as the Eiffel, or the trace pipeline to look the same as the Eiffel pipeline, we need to have a new trace parent and a new span for each Eiffel events that is being sent. And we have to always take the correct trace parent. When I'm triggering my test, I have to pick the correct Eiffel event, and then I also have to pick the correct trace parent, which should be in that event, in order to get both graphs to look the same. So I'm not sure I see the benefit of having two graphs. Sorry, Magnus.
No, I just think that I don't know if that's the goal either. I mean, to get the exact same graph in both cases, then it's just redundant. So I think the strength is rather to connect them at the edge. In other words, if you have if you go back to the previous examples, you build them as traces, but your CI pipeline doesn't. The interesting thing would be connecting your Eiffel pipeline to the root trace of your build in that case. And in the second case, if you have traces from your pipeline and you want to have Eiffel events for artifacts, it's sort of that the boundary. You would want to connect your artifact to whatever span you get from your CI pipeline. So sort of the case where you have a whole tree of activities and things that happen, I don't think there's any reason to have both Eiffel events and spans for everything. It's more connecting the boundaries. And then you would have to choose sort of what domain you want to be in. You are having a you want to have full visibility into your build process, and that's where traces make the most sense. But for the high level CI pipeline, traces aren't as good of a tool as we think Eiffel is. And you want to bridge those two concepts. I think that's the use case, not replicating the whole graph.
Would it make sense then to replace all activity events in a current Eiffel pipeline with trace events instead?
Maybe. Although we would run into the limitation. Well, there would be, I think one limitation would be that you would no longer have the activity started, activity finished. You would only have a single span that's emitted at the very end. So building like a progressive pipeline visualizer would be difficult. And secondly, we have fairly rich methods of connecting activities. I mean, we have causes, we have context, we have precursor, we have was it original trigger? It ended up be calling, I think. But we don't have that richness for spans, as far as I know. You have the span.
There are no semantic links, right? There are no semantic trace links or traces, and everything is just a trace.
Not quite as good anyway. You have the span links, but what I've read in the documentation about those is that they indicate causality only, which I find it's a little bit weird if they don't have sort of the possibility of expressing other kinds of relationships. I mean, span links is that's very broad, and it seems they're saying, oh, this is for causality. And if that's true, it's a little bit unfortunate. So I think that speaks against using traces as a drop-in replacement for Eiffel activities.
Yeah, I'm wondering a bit then how the OpenTelemetry guys sees their now to be their intended CI/CD semantic convention thingy coming out. What in that would be CI/CD specific then? If it's not on that level, it's only on like lower levels.
Not only, I think, but I mean, it's unless there's a misconception on my part, which is totally conceivable, but maybe it just won't work that well for, let's say, long-lived pipelines. And it won't work well for real-time observation of what's going on. But after the build is completed, you can debug it as much as you wish.
But I guess the semantic convention is like talking about pipelines. Unfortunately, I've had time to dig into semantic conventions. There are other ones, but maybe it's okay. This is a pipeline. The span is we're talking about a pipeline and so on. So define the different type of levels and so on. So it's easier communicating between them. But I think it's going to be the same structure. As far as I know, that they seem to only look at semantics, but not change anything in the protocol itself. So it basically is for debugging backwards.
Yeah, but they call it the CI/CD observability semantic convention, not the CI/CD afterwards tracing semantic convention.
But maybe they think observability is afterwards.
Okay, could be. Yeah, that would be interesting to see.
I mean, that's actually an interesting question to bring to that group. Do we? Yeah. How is that supposed to work with real-time observation of things?
Mm.
I mean, that's very useful use case indeed.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question if I am allowed.
You may.
So with can you jump back to the Eiffel event again? So with this, we also would assume that everyone at the place that we are sending in the Eiffel events also use the same trace server. Because if I am using we are using our own deployment, for instance, Jaeger or whatever we want to use, and you, Magnus, over at your place, you use something else. When you send events, I won't be able to connect to your traces because I use another server.
Well, yeah, but you could make the connection, but nobody would be able to view them at the same time. That's correct. Because
No, you can't make the connection if the trace parent does not exist in my database, then I cannot make the connection to your traces unless I connect to your database or your tracing server.
I mean, you could in your code you could make the connection, and you can certainly emit a span that connects to an ID. It's just that ID won't be known on the receiving end.
I think we are talking about different things. So if I were to send a span and I say that my parent is your the ID that you have attached to the Eiffel event, then I cannot send that span to my trace server.
Oh, you can send it. Why wouldn't you be able to send it?
It will say error, this ID does not exist.
Who says that?
At least, I don't know if it's the Jaeger collector or the OpenTelemetry collector.
Okay, but because I mean, how would it know? I mean, first of all, spans could be sent in different order. So I wonder if maybe if Jaeger has more knowledge of that. But I mean, OTel collectors are designed to be, running on different machines, and I mean, it's completely impossible for an OTel collector to know about all the possible spans that you could be connecting to.
So I don't know how it works exactly, but I do know that when I was testing the trace parent and sending that with the headers, I got that error quite a lot of times when I wrote the wrong ID.
Okay.
So, and that happened. So when the collector or whichever that sends the actual span to the server that is going to visualize it, it will report an error. But hey, this parent ID does not exist. This trace does not exist.
Yeah, that surprises me a bit, but either way, sure, it does. Using this does require that you are sending the data to the same place.
Yeah.
Yep. So
And
if
is
you
that
have different sort of trace collection domains, you're going to end up in a bad spot in some way.
Yeah,
So
so
basically,
my question there is that an actual problem? Is this something we want to actually put up as a recommendation in the Eiffel community that if you are using the OpenTelemetry tracing support in the meta field, you should use the same tracing domain for all your traces? Is that something we want to do as an Eiffel community?
If we get to the point that we want to have meta trace context at all, yes, that would be a natural recommendation, yes. Because otherwise you're going to have the disconnected spans and it won't be terribly useful.
this is the same kind of problem that we have today within Ericsson when we have domains. Yep. That we have our Eiffel events in different event repositories.
But if we would then add like a domain ID to this trace context, saying in what trace domain was this sent, then we could find that out, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
then you would at least know which domain it is. Yes. On the other
Yeah.
hand, I wonder if this is maybe something of. I mean, it's not a made up problem, obviously, but since the trace context standard doesn't contain such a concept, it seems like the rest of the world thinks that yes, of course, traces must live, be stored in the same place. If they are, if they're not, then you're out of luck. Period.
Yeah. But we see that the Eiffel events could span multiple organizations and going down to customer networks and different things. So
Yep.
we don't have that limitation in the Eiffel event setup as I see it. So yeah, that's good
Yeah, I
to
mean,
know.
it could still be legitimate to have like a domain ID or something like that in the trace context object, as in this example. If nothing else, it could serve as a help to consumers.
Because I guess there isn't any, this thing with having multiple trace domains and so on, it shouldn't be very unique. So maybe somebody has thought about it and written about it in the whole OTel documentation, maybe. But yeah, but I agree. It's something we can at least recommend and think of, or note at least our users, since we're looking on a broader place.
So did you have anything more to show there, Magnus, or?
I do have one other slide. We
well,
usually take a break after 1 hour.
Yeah, good.
So
I was just
depends
before
on
we take the
how
break.
long it's gonna.
Yeah, I was just curious if people might leave and so on. I see Jonathan, you're here from Nasdaq there. What is your take on this? Do you have any experience at all on OpenTelemetry, or mostly here for information, or what do you get out of this?
We are not using it currently. It might be in the future. What we use now is with Kibana, and we also now are adding on. I forgot the name of it. Another service mostly for logs.
Thanks. Yeah, for me, we can have a break. I guess it's good to not rush the end of this discussion.
Yeah, there's a risk that they can think, oh, it'll only take another 5 minutes, and then it's 5 more and 5 more, and people have questions, and suddenly it's.
But we
late,
might not feel like more than 50 more minutes. So should we reconvene at 10 past?
Yeah, that's fine for me.
Time to get a quick coffee and so on. Yeah. So 10 past, we're back.
All right. So I had one more slide. That's quite a bit shorter. Let's see how much discussion it results in. But the other way around is to reference Eiffel events from your spans. And here we can use span attributes to link to Eiffel activities. I'm writing activities here specifically. I think that's the only thing that makes sense. Although theoretically, of course, we could connect them in other ways. Wait a minute, I'm saying activities, and then in my example, I have an artifact. Okay. Anyway, as opposed to Eiffel events, span attributes or attributes in general in OpenTelemetry, they do have the semantic conventions that establish, well, conventions for expressing particular things. But apart from that, you could add arbitrary attributes if you like. It's strongly suggested that you namespace them based on your company domain or similar. So in our case, we don't have a domain, but we could use the GitHub domain, I'm thinking. So if you are processing a particular Eiffel event and you have a span for that, you could add span attributes like this to your span. So the point of this would be that you would you could easily search through your whatever tool is collecting your spans to locate all the spans that process a particular event, for example. I think that could be quite useful. And if we include meta type, you could, of course, filter based on the types as well. Potentially, you could, of course, add other key attributes. Again, it's the schema isn't fixed. So in this particular case of artifact creations, we could imagine a span attributes that includes the identity of the artifact, for example. That could perhaps be useful. And this is really the only way the only way of linking spans to Eiffel events that I've been able to find. And we're already using this, not with its exact namespace, but we're playing around with it in one of our applications that uses OpenTelemetry and processes Eiffel events. Maybe this is sort of a simpler case than the other way around. Seems a little bit more straightforward.
Because here you then you have, but you're talking about processing. So basically you have an Eiffel event and then you start a span where you put in the Eiffel event.
Yeah, it could be that, or another option could be if like one of the examples in the earlier slide where you have an Eiffel based CI pipeline, but you are building your build is OpenTelemetry enabled. Then you could have, if you include this in your build span or your build trace, you could trace it back to an Eiffel activity, for example. Again, here we'll get into what I talked about earlier about including these links in the boundaries between Eiffel and OpenTelemetry.
So maybe I'm discussing. Maybe I'm one step ahead now, and we should connect only spans to Eiffel events. But the question was also if you have Eiffel events linked to spans linked to Eiffel event, they got dual links like this. Which ID will you basically need to create an ID first before to start a span in order to have the dual link, but maybe we don't want that dual link, so we don't have the problem.
No, that's maybe that kind of. I'm thinking. Let's see. When do we get into that situation? That would be if you're creating within a span, you're emitting an event. That would be that use case, right?
I guess it's because we said previously that if you want to send a activity event, you basically need to start a span first and then send activity events. But then that span, if that would be including the activity event, then you basically need to generate the activity event, start the span, then send the Eiffel event, because then you got span ID.
You can set attributes on an active span because it only gets sent when it gets closed.
Yep.
So you start the span, send the activity, add the attributes, and then close the span, and it gets sent.
So what exactly does starting a span mean? That doesn't publish anything outside of your own application. It's just something local, or?
It pre-creates the span and sets a start time on it. And then you attach stuff to it, and when it closes, it sets a stop time and publishes it.
And during that time, the information is only local to your application in your whatever tracing library you use.
Yep.
Okay.
So the only required input when you create a span is, there are almost none actually. It'll generate the ID for you. You could send in a parent span and a span kind, but the span kind can, I think, be set afterwards as well. Might be a little bit SDK dependent, but yes, you can certainly attach attributes as long as the span is open.
But then the parent span that can also be added afterwards, theoretically at least.
Yes, although if we go back to the trace context here, the parent is included in this. So if you create a span without a parent and then you make an HTTP request, the trace parent header will be incorrect if you set the parent afterwards.
Aha, because you need to propagate the trace parent to your
Yes.
subs. Okay, yeah.
But I mean, it's somewhat theoretical discussion. I mean, if you use the SDKs, which you should be doing, then things will just work. And if the SDKs don't allow you to set the parent ID after the fact, that's probably something that says something, I guess.
But how does it work then for a parent span? So if you have a, say, pipeline level application, something that creates a span, which is then used as a parent to a step, pipeline step, for example, then you finish that step and that child span is then sent, right? But the parent span is not yet closed, so it's not just sent. Then the parent span, the parent ID is then exposed to the tracing server. But here is some parent ID which you haven't seen yet because it hasn't been closed, that span, but this is what I was part of. And that means that in some way you could see a progress of all these different step child spans, right? The progress on the parent level, so to say, because all of those are connected to the same parent. Do I make sense?
You don't know anything about the parent.
No, yeah, just that this step and that step, they are both connected to the same parent. I don't know what the parent is, but they are. I see that they are related somehow. But I don't. You're correct. I don't know where that parent. Anything more about that parent, unless I include that in my child span as well.
Yep.
So I guess I could include information about the source change, for example, if I'm a pipeline step. Yeah. So then you could actually theoretically see that for this source change, certain number of steps has already passed because they all belong to the same parent, even though it's only the first step that actually connects to the source change.
Yep.
Hmm?
I suppose. Yeah. That's another thing I've been thinking about actually. As a concept in OpenTelemetry known as baggage, which is attributes or, well, some kind of pieces of data that's passed down through the stack, but they aren't span attributes, but they should be propagated. They could be turned into span attributes by a child span, but they are sort of disconnected. So maybe depending on things, it might be something that we want to have in this kind of trace context here. If we want to have, make it possible for the sort of the trace context forwarding that's explicitly supported for HTTP headers I talked about earlier, where an HTTP server doesn't create any spans of its own, but it forwards the trace context as is. And this could include the baggage header, which is a separate header. So if we choose to have the trace context inside the Eiffel events, maybe we should also propagate or include the baggage. Otherwise, that kind of forwarding would be incomplete. And the typical use case for baggage that I've discovered myself is that some things that you might want to have as trace or span attributes, they aren't available at all places in the span hierarchy. And maybe it's only known at the top. It's only there that you know the API endpoint or some kind of ID that goes into the request. You don't know that further down the stack, so you would include that ID or whatever it is in the baggage and pass it through the trace context all the way down. And then individual spans can choose whether to extract pieces from the baggage and include them as span attributes.
Because that was something I was wondering when it comes to Eiffel events, but maybe what was you talking about that if you, for example, if you get triggered by an Eiffel event and you have a root span and then you have several subspans, should each different span reference the Eiffel event, or should it only be the root span that reference the Eiffel event?
I don't know what the convention is there, really.
So I guess that's an open question then.
Yeah, I think it is. I'm guessing that the convention is to not propagate everything, because it would just create a lot of really redundant data, and it would be a lot more work if you would have to, each time you create a new span, you would have to bring in lots of stuff from the baggage into the span attributes.
Okay, so basically it's the convention is to use the root span then.
That's just my guess, because of the way it's implemented, where you explicitly have to bring data from the baggage into your span attributes. And I haven't seen anything in the SDK that makes it super simple to do. So I'm just guessing that you have the possibility of doing that via the baggage, but it's not something that you perhaps should do habitually. Well, that's my guess.
For searchability, at least in Jaeger, an attribute only needs to exist in one span. So there's no need to have an attribute in more than one span anywhere in the trace.
Good.
But I don't know if there's any difference between Jaeger and the other.
No, I mean, regardless, even if you would, only get one span, you could navigate and I mean, regardless of, unless you're using an extremely poor tool, you should be able to navigate and see the whole trace based on just a single span. So.
When it comes to processing this data, have you seen that most recipients is humans, where it's kind of like the end is human? So basically you create these spans and everything, and you of course need something to process them to make an image of it or something. But it's basically the hierarchy there is that mainly humans that read that?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. That,
Because
and the aggregations of durations and so on.
Okay.
And you would have alerts, but I mean the visual representation, that's for humans.
Because the Eiffel events is kind of like there we we aim at having automatic processing or machine processing of the events. So that maybe is also a difference, if I understand things correct now, that in Eiffel we want to machine process everything, but in OTel basically it's you process it, but the end goal is presenting it for a user or something, a human.
I mean, there are many end goals. That's one of them, and it's probably a more prominent use case for traces than what it is for Eiffel events. I mean, if it was more important for Eiffel events, maybe we would have a proper visualizing tool after 6 years of having it open source, but we don't. So apparently, it's not that interesting. Maybe.
So that also brings me, when you say visualizing tools, this is probably diverging off the subject, so stop me here. But for example, could you take, if you have a chain of Eiffel like activity events and convert them into spans and send it off to OTel, and then you get the graphical representation there?
Interesting, sure. I don't see a real problem there. That's actually interesting, because I mean, even though you would lose what we talked about earlier about the richness of relationship between events, but if you just have a pipeline and you want to, you want to get a Gantt chart basically out of your pipeline, sure. Reading maybe from the event repository and converting it into sort of fake spans with fake timestamps. Well, I mean, not fake, but the timestamps aren't real time, but they come from the Eiffel events instead. Sure, you could use that to recreate it. An interesting idea. I'm not sure the SDKs would allow you to modify the timestamp necessarily. So you might have to do some tricks there.
Yeah, because the SDKs are probably instrumentation SDKs that it's like you're inside a running program, and then you
Yeah. I mean, yeah, they're not aimed at doing that kind of conversion in batch form. That's, yeah, it's somewhat abusive, but it's an interesting use case.
But is the kind of a sentiment a little bit that we think it's better with going from spans pointing to Eiffel rather than Eiffel pointing to spans?
I don't think there's any better or worse here. It's all about the use cases. If we go back to this one. I mean, what's the most common case? What kind of boundaries do you want to bridge? Is it from Eiffel to OTel, or the other way around? I think that both cases are legitimate, but I'm sure there's one of the cases is going to be more common than the other. But I don't know which one. Yeah. I mean, it's yeah. Again, both are legitimate cases, so it's probably something we should aim to support either way.
But then we need to make the if we wanted to support both, I'm not saying no. Then we should also include a case if you want to do a double link and how to solve it. So we have some ideas around there, I think.
That's probably a good idea,
yeah. At least in my head, when it comes to span and Eiffel, is that Eiffel is more on kind of like a bigger level, and then you're getting into each tool that probably is instrumented, and then you basically point up to the Eiffel ones.
Yeah. One well, no, but one thing where it's not the double pointed arrows that you're talking about, but for the pipeline, it's perhaps more realistic that it uses Eiffel, depending on the size of your pipeline. But if you have sort of more an enterprise pipeline, where the sort of organization where you might be running Eiffel in the first place, you could totally have Eiffel for pipeline level stuff. You use traces for instrumenting builds, and in the end, you produce an artifact that's Eiffel, and you want to link it to the trace of the build process, as well as the owning Eiffel activity as well. So that's again, it's not the double angled or bidirectional arrow that you're talking about in terms of linking, but it's at least links in both directions in the same use case.
But when you talk about logs, it triggers me. Today we have, in some cases, we have logs. I don't remember which Eiffel event it is that we point to logs, and usually it's like a file or something. If you want to point to hotel logging, should you then use these trace contexts, or how should you point them? Or should we?
They're different.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, hotel traces and hotel logs are different animals. So I think the existing way of linking to logs in, for example, activity finished would still, I think, be valid. The persistent logs object contains one or more URLs to where the logs can be found. So I mean,
but what about the live logs then? If the live logs would be stored as hotel logs, would those then not be identified by some log ID rather than a URL?
I don't know. I don't think entries have, or I mean, yeah. I haven't been really paying attention to the hotel logs, but yeah, maybe. But I guess in the end, I mean, to be able to look at the logs, you still want to have the URL of some log viewer or something. I mean, even if you would link to, let's say, if hotel logging had some kind of like a stream ID representing the stream of logs from someplace, maybe you would want to include that stream ID in persistent logs, perhaps. Although in the end, you would need to have a URL to actually view the logs. So yeah. But I don't think they have that kind of identification of either, not individual log entries and not the log streams either. I don't think so, but I haven't been reading too much into it or about it.
And then if we want to, for example, if you have an artifact and you want to link to the logs or activity finish or whatever, and you want to link to the logs in the form of traces, then you would use the trace context then instead. Did you follow my train there? Thoughts?
No, not quite.
So basically, instead of having, if you do some operation and you want to link to logs, but your logs is not like log files, but it's more of like a trace, then it'd get better than we're using. So we always use traces, then we have a trace context if you want to dig down further. Seems like I'm confusing more than helping. So
maybe, I mean, traces and logs are pretty different things. And they're, yeah.
I guess one thought there would be that the logs we currently link from the data object in each event that are concerned about logs, which is actually any kind of activity type events, I guess. But now we say that the trace context here should be in the meta object. How do we differentiate those things? It might make sense, as we've been to connect to a trace from any type of actual event. And by that, it makes sense to have it in the meta object, maybe. But at the same time, we could consider the live logs that we have today as some kind of meta information for activity type events, which would then maybe also be suitable to have actually in the meta part for activity events at least. You see where I'm getting? Thinking if we should have had a fourth object in our events. No, maybe not. Something in between meta and data, which is common for multiple event types, but not for all event types or something.
Something between meta and data. Is that
I mean,
metadata? Then?
meta are things that are common for all events, right? And data are things that should be specific for each event. But for the activity events, both activity and test case and test suite, all those events, they have live logs, for example. So it would make sense to have a common way of defining that activity specific part of the event schema. But now I'm outside the subject of tracing. I'm rather into logging now, but yeah. I don't know if it really makes sense to have traces connected to all types of events. For example, a flow context defined event. Would it ever make sense to have a trace connected to that one? Or are the events that are suitable to have connections to traces, are those of a specific group or type?
Yeah, that's subject to debate. My thought was that it's perhaps easy to say that there's never need to connect a flow context to a trace, and it would only be activities and artifacts maybe. And then you ask someone who works in a different company, and it's like, oh, of course we want to have our flow context connected to spans. I mean, it's maybe there's no point in limiting it.
Yeah.
Because it's still conceivable wherever. I mean, as long as wherever you send your float context defined event, if that's done in the context of a span, it makes sense to connect them.
Yeah, it does.
It probably won't be such a common case, but for flow context specifically. But there's nothing wrong with it.
No, I think what I'm getting at is for a specific deployment of Eiffel in a certain organization, the meta object, even though it has optional parts in it, I would assume that each event sent in that environment would have the same parameters or properties in their meta objects. Some might use the source, some might not use it, and so on. But they would probably have all of the events in one organization would probably use the same to some extent. But when we talk about the trace properties now, they might only be sent for certain events in this organization because that's when you want to connect it to traces. So it makes the trace context property a bit different than the rest of the meta properties to me.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I'm not sure if that makes it an argument for not having it in meta, instead having it in a new object on top level. But
Yeah, I know that kind of sort of sparse trace context. You're totally right about them, but I'm not sure it's a problem. Another case where you could have a difference, sort of structural difference between events, could be if you're signing your events. You would definitely be signing your artifact events, for example, but maybe not your test case events for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yeah, correct.
But I guess in this discussion, we should also maybe include some kind of note or even maybe a recommendation around longevity. I mean, if you have your Eiffel events are long-lived and spans are short-lived, do we recommend to let the spans point to the Eiffel events because it's the shorter life span of a span is the ones that the entity that has the shorter lifespan should point to the one with the longer lifespan, and not to have too many dead links. But maybe that's organizational specific also. But
Yeah, I mean, that's reasonable, but it only applies in narrow cases because, I mean, the direction of your links depends on the direction of your boundaries. So in many cases, you don't get to choose in which direction the arrow points, right? If you are sending Eiffel events as part of a span, you would have to, you want to link from the event to the surrounding span or the surrounding trace context. You don't have the option of doing it the other way around. Necessarily, at least. It depends on the context.
Or I thought when there's the BS said you can add things to a span afterwards. So if you have
correct, but let's say the span and the artifact, they're created in different processes, for example. So if it's just the same piece of code that creates the span and sends the artifact event, sure, then you could attach the artifact created ID to the span. But if you just you're running a child process or something like that, and it's the one doing the artifact creation, sending of the artifact created call event. I'm getting tired. Then you can't add the attributes. Unless, of course, you could be returning the event ID to the calling process, which has the span, and then it could add it to the span as an attribute. I mean, but good, yeah. I don't think we can rely on that always to be available.
So what's the next steps then? Was this your last slide then, or not this one, but the one you showed before?
Yep. I think I've shown all slides. Yes, that's the last one.
So where are we taking this? It feels a bit that we would benefit from having a whiteboard session on a coming meetup.
Yep. I think
so.
Have
a whiteboard session online, but it seems to maybe have it physically as well. So that's one idea of taking this forward. But I guess since you're quite much into OpenTelemetry now locally in Axis, maybe you'd anyway consider this going forward a bit.
Yeah, probably. And I think also the CI/CD semantic conventions discussion, or that working group within. Yep. I mean, there will, if we follow along in that discussion, we're probably going to learn interesting things, and also the relationship to CD events.
Yeah. So are there any specific things we should focus on for Eiffel, or like put up actions or tasks for Eiffel on? Or should we just see where it goes?
I think for now, let's see where it goes, and maybe like have it in the back of our minds.
Yeah.
it seems premature to start drafting a protocol change to add a trace context field, for example.
Yeah.
But I also don't know really what kind of research we would have to make. So yeah, I guess wait and see is maybe the best course of action for now anyway.
Thinking about research, do we know of any academia that talks about traces and that could be interested to set up some kind of academic work on traces versus pipelines? Or
Nothing I've heard of.
no? Maybe we can mention it to our contact at Liv. But we'll see. Yeah, good. Any comments or questions more from Panos or Jonathan?
Not from my
No.
side.
Not for me.
Glad to see you joining and keeping up with us. Okay, anything more from Magnus or Tobias?
No, I'm all out of words, I think.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Magnus, for
Yeah.
preparing this and leading the discussion. It's been great and a good insight.
Thanks. Good
Thank-
discussion.
Yeah. Let's end it there then.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you and see you
All right.
next time.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. See you.
Thank you, guys. See you.
See you. Bye.